You unlock this benefit with the key of Patreon. Beyond is another dimension. A dimension of thought. A dimension of speculation. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both waffle and substance. Of things and ideas. You've just crossed into the podcast zone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Trekking Through the Twilight Zone, and we are going to be doing a double header. So this one's probably going to go a little long, and we are going to be going to Maple Street. The monsters are on Maple Street. Now, this is an episode about a small group living on a street, and was then remade in 2002. I think you were saying 2003.
2003, yeah.
And sort of represents
the third Twilight Zone series.
Yes, and was it represents sort of like I don't know what they call, like a neighborhood, a community care group or something, sort of a similar thing. But basically, the power goes out, and this group in both the sort of the 60 version, the 2003 version, starts to point fingers, and culprits are identified, and suspicions and paranoia are run rife. We'll start with the first episode and the 960, and we are going to run over because it's going to be a double header, so enjoy it. So, Monsters on Maple Street. First thoughts.
I mean, the original is the monsters are due on Maple Street, and then the remake, they took out that due, which kind of makes sense because the point is the monsters are the people, right?
Yes.
So, in the first one, it's obviously a sort of Red Scare story. Using aliens as the communists, and in the second one, it's terrorism, and so we'll get to the second one in a few minutes. But I mean, this is considered one of the most classic Twilight Zone episodes, and I think it reminds me. We've talked about Twilight Zone writing and how much I admire sort of the conciseness and the proper unveiling of plot and implication. This reminds me of just like classic drama of like 12 Angry Men. It has that sort of just like good playwriting dialogue to it.
Yeah, I think the thing is, let's say this film, because again, the thing we have to remember about this as well is because it gets in some really cool places. These are 22 minutes long, maybe 25 at a push, and this thing sets up characters very, very quickly. It uses some shorthand, but does it in a really nice, strong way where, when these divisions come down, you know who you're following, where their opinions are coming from, and it's just done really well. So, I was pulled into this really quickly. I think it's a really well done episode. It feels very... What's the word I'm looking for? Like, I assume this may be one of the first versions of this story, but this episode felt very influential. This idea of this dissent amongst close groups. So I was thinking of like, obviously there's the remake, but things like The Burbs with the Tom Hanks film. This idea of suburbia, but also a film like, say, The Mist, the Stephen King, sort of based on Stephen King. Any film where you get like a group of people or a group of disparate people stuck together in a situation, and the suspicion starts to sort of and paranoia starts to run rife. Like this episode, sort of, I wouldn't say it was a cliche. I think it sort of sets up a lot of those things where, this has been a very influential episode. So it was quite cool to sort of see that.
Yeah, and it's relatively early, to see that sort of thing. I mean, in that sense, it's sort of like it borrows from the Arthur Miller play, The Crucible, which is 1953, and which uses the Salem witch trials as an allegory for the Red Scare.
Yeah.
So, here it's aliens. And, the funny thing is that because it's the Twilight Zone, we're seeing lots of aliens. And in fact, at the end, it was aliens, right? You see them boarding their flying saucer. So their beliefs are it is completely possible in this universe that this is aliens. But I think, it's the unraveling of the community. It's the way an idea is seized upon, and it's the way you see that idea, just sort of that germ of an idea, like, it's like Inception, right? That germ of an idea just grows and develops and mutates, and then fingers are pointed and more fingers are pointed. And I find myself thinking, of the madness of crowds and of times that I have, been in scenario. I mean, I'm so scared of, I've said before that I'm so scared of like concerts, where it's like, you should not be this enthusiastic, if the singer comes up and says like, all right, now we're going to burn down the, target this minority, you guys would just go right away. Everything he says you think is brilliant. I just get this fear, and having been in car crashes and situations where, I was in a situation where a guy had fallen and his head was caved in and there was blood on the ground, but it was at night. And I watched people twice my age go over and say, oh, no, here's a pen. The pen broke and that's ink. And I had to dip my hands in it and hold it up to the light and say, no, look, this is blood. We have to get this dude to a hospital. And I was the only one who, I mean, you're just around people who, you realize you're going to have to, this ability of humans to believe in things because others are believing them,
It's also, like I say, it's about having that narrative, isn't it? Like, if you can connect the dots for a narrative, and that's the sort of thing, that's where, this both episodes sort of hit this point of, so in the first episode, one guy's his car, no one else's stuff, all the electrics are off, including cars and everything. And but his car can start, and
it starts by itself.
It starts by itself, yeah, and it singles him out, and all of a sudden it becomes this narrative of, well, yes, and he does do these weird things, and someone else points out that, well, yeah, I've seen him outside at night staring at the sky, and so something that, if you saw one of your neighbours actually doing, you would go, Occam's razor. All right, they're either into astronomy or, like you say, can't sleep and probably catching some air, probably out for a smoke or something like that. Whatever, doesn't really matter, not my business. But all of a sudden, in this scenario, yeah, your car's the one that starts on itself, which now singles you out. I now know this piece of information about you, and because because of the situation we're in, I'm going to connect these two things, and I'm going to come up with Space Alien.
Yeah.
But I love the fact that this keeps happening. Like, the main guy who's trying to sort of take control of the situation, sort of the pragmatic one, is going like, hang on, like none of this makes any sense. Stop being so ridiculous. That he has a ham radio, but he's like, his wife for some reason has been talking about the fact he's always down there, and he's like, yeah, but it's just a ham radio. It's like, yeah, but who are you talking to? Who's talking to you? And it again, all of a sudden, it's like, I now know this piece of information and this piece of information that in no other circumstances will I put together. But right now, I'm drawing a line between them, and I'm making this conspiracy theory. And that's how conspiracy theories work. And that's how these sort of, like, insane narratives build up, where these two events did happen, but and usually they would not be considered in the same, conversation. But right now, I'm drawing a line between them.
Well, and of course, now we live in the culture of conspiracy theorists.
Yes. Yeah.
Everything is a damn conspiracy theory. One of the things that I really like about what you're saying and about the episode is, this way in which, if you are asking the question itself has power, right? Like, I mean, does Joe Biden eat babies? I'm only asking questions, this thing that they do of saying, I'm only asking questions. The question itself has power, because the implication is that
it drops an idea in someone's head.
Right. And this might be true. This is a valid line of inquiry. And then when you start looking for evidence, if you are looking for evidence to confirm something, you will find that evidence. And
the other thing as well is just that you say about evidence. Not finding evidence is sometimes just as good as finding evidence, and that's part of the problem.
Right.
Absence of evidence becomes evidence.
Yes. And and you see throughout the episode situations in which somebody is confronted by the rest of the group, and you think, okay, what should they say here? And you realize there's no right answer. That anything that they say, just like during the Red Scare, will aggravate the crowd further. So if you say, like, this is ridiculous, well, how dare you defy Congress? What are you covering up for? Why? We are trying to stop aliens on our block. Why are you making fun of this? This is a serious matter. Who would make fun of this except for an alien? On the other hand, if you say, yes, it's true that I have a ham radio, but I use it for this. Okay, well, you've confessed to that. Let's see it. Right? Yeah. Let's go the next step further. Now, who are you talking to? Right? So there's no right answer. There's no way to shut this down.
I mean, this to me, like you said, that one thing of like, it's that joke, isn't it? Sort of, you say to someone, oh, that's exactly what they want you to think, or that's exactly what, a space alien would say. And it makes me think of like, whenever I hear of this thing, I always think of what they call the ducking stool, which was a tool used to identify witches. It's that thing of like, we shall hold them under the water for so long. If they drown, then they're not a witch. If they don't drown, then they are a witch, and we can burn them. And you're sort of like, you can't win on this one. Like, so it's that sort of like catch-22. Like, you've created this ridiculous narrative in your head, and no matter what happens now, you are still going to try and navigate to this conclusion. Like, you've reached the conclusion and you are going to navigate to it no matter how you get there. And I kind of like the way this episode does that repeatedly. Like, it'll sort of point at different people, and the guy that does it, I like. Again, it's a bit of a trope that I think this episode may have kickstarted, but it's the loudmouth wearing the loud shirt.
Yeah.
And I like
gung ho, who's a bit of a hotspur.
Yeah, and the thing is, and again, he is repeated in by, and I forget the actor's name in the 2003 version, but I know him from Bosch and a couple of other things he's been in. But I like him as an actor; he's very good. But he plays that same role as being sort of like, but in that they give him like the football jacket and all that kind of stuff. But it feels all too real, doesn't it? The loudmouth in the group that's like, well, that's what we should be doing. It's straight to pulling guns, or straight to suspicion, or straight to, pointing at the other. Well,
and we both live in cultures in which this is happening, right? I mean, and has always happened. And maybe this is true of all cultures. But we like to think that we are above it and that we are better. Whether it was, anti-Islam, Islamophobia after 9/11, or, anti-Iranian sentiment, after the Iranian hostage crisis. Now there's, again, the other is, Mexicans and, and now Afghanis who might, come here and invade us,
it goes back, quote. So after Pearl Harbor, there was the anti-Japanese sentiment in America. You ever get a chance to read George Takei's memoirs about it? Like, it was this instant reaction of, hang on, that's the other. We've got to get everything like it out because it can't be trusted, and that's the key to this. It's trust, isn't it? It comes to a sort of the. I like the end result of the first one because it centers on an individual. The fact that like loudmouth, he brings his shotgun. Nobody else seems to. They sort of like they're all fine. There's a moment when the guy says like, why have a gun? This is ridiculous. Like, he actually highlights the ludicrousness of the situation. And then when he pulls the gun back, and then there's someone walking down the street in shadow, and they fire the gun, it kills this old guy, and he then starts to try to defend his position, and everyone's like, well, no, you fired. Like, you're accountable for this. Like, you've got to face up to this. And then it's sort of like, like I say, But before that, it's the fact there's a moment, like a little mini montage of them blaming everybody. They blame the kid
Yeah.
and everything. Like, it's just.
Well, what's interesting there, and this goes back to like Salem, is like Charlie, who shot Pete Van Horn, who was scouting Floral Street. You never find out if like, I mean, this is maybe a problem. Like, you never find out if one street over, all the lights are on, right? You think you would see that, but yeah. So Charlie, cornered, is deflects the suspicion onto Tommy as the kid who, he raised the alien possibility, which is, from Pulp Fiction, right? So, and that's sort of like, okay, well, now I'm under investigation. You've got to name names. You've got to, accuse others to throw the mob off, effectively killing you. And, here again, we see this in not just Salem, but we see this in, the Red Scare. You've got to name names. We see this.
It happened, and that's the thing. Because I love his reaction. He's on his doorstep. He's been hit, and he's got his head's bleeding, and people are turning on him. And he says, "No, I know who it was. I know who it was. I'll tell you who it was." And everyone stops because they've been throwing stones at him. And he does. He singles out the kid, and everyone turns on the boy. And it's this thing, like I say, this deflection. I not so long ago read Vincent Price's, obviously, we talked about him recently, but Vincent Price's biography. And in that, he talks about working in Hollywood in the late 40s and early 50s, and that happened to him. He was brought up because he was relatively liberal. They was accused of being a communist. He was cleared. But he says one of the things that they said to him was, this can go away if you name other people.
Right.
And he risked being blackballed in Hollywood because he was like, well, I don't know anyone.
And a lot of people were blackballed. I mean, a lot of people lost their careers. Their marriages were destroyed. Their lives were destroyed. And all for nothing. In many cases, the truth was that some people were communists, but they weren't plotting to overthrow the government in league with Russia. And some people had been to a meeting, 20 years earlier when it wasn't a big deal. They were on college and they went to a meeting to find out more, and they, got a flyer and never thought about it again. But, now they're on some list as you went to a communist meeting. What, in the 30s? Mean, when we're going through the Great Depression, yeah, of course there were some communist meetings. Capitalism had really failed at that time. So I mean, those dynamics of group madness and how you cannot defend yourself. Nothing will satisfy the mob. And how this just snowballs and snowballs and snowballs. And we think we're better than it, right? We think we're over this. We're not. And that's sort of the point, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I find interesting between the two episodes, because I think they modernize it very well. Like, I really enjoyed both versions. The first one sort of is very 50s. So they see a meteorite fire over the street, the neighborhood, and it does end up being aliens. Like, the end is these two aliens are sort of sat there, basically sort of like dicking around with stuff on the street, and they're like, oh, okay, we know if we were to invade, it would take about 4 or 5 hours before a street turns on itself. Like, okay, and we can. I mean, the invasion plan sounds terrible because they say they're going to go from one street to the next. I'm like, that sounds like a long, plan. But the intent is there, and the idea is that again, we tear ourselves apart. The start of the redo of the remake, I love the fact that it starts with this sort of housing association. What do they call it? Sort of like community together. Homeowners Association. That's what I was thinking. And it's this idea of they're talking about Christmas decorations. All right, so they're going to go up after Thanksgiving. They're going to be down by January the 6th. And then the woman whose husband is in the army, sort of like, she's saying, well, can we make everything uniform because it looks so nice? And can we do this? Can we do that? And then already, before anything happens, they're already pointing fingers. They're a judgmental bunch of bastards because they're like, well, some people just couldn't be bothered to make it. And then you have the main couple, I say, going, well, there's a football match. Like, our kids are in a football final, in a soccer final, and there's lots of people there. And I love the fact that like the lead guy, who really pisses me off in this, like they've cast everyone quite well in this, like the guy, the black guy with glasses, he's like, well, my kids are in the final and I'm here, and all I can think is like, well, you're a prick, like, you know. You've wanted to. He's like, but I love the fact that he's like, these meetings are held the third Saturday of every month, and it's, you know, that's the rule. And I like the fact that like, it's, you know, it's a great display of uniformity, a drive for uniformity and community, but it's all a facade. And it falls apart within 5 hours. And and that to me felt more modern and really sort of hit home on a couple of things. And so, yeah, no, but, you know, I like the redo. I thought it was a really good starting point.
Yeah, and you know, I agree. I think it sort of starts a little slower with that homeowners association meeting, but I also got it and got what they were doing and liked it. I don't mind that guy saying like, no, I'm here. Yeah, decisions are made, you know, show up or don't have a voice. But then they talk about how like, oh yeah, nobody's invited the new family, you know. Then the implication is that they're ethnic in some way, and you know they're a little strange, and nobody's bothered to really go up. You know, they're sort of keeping to themselves. They've got a fence up. What about that fence? But yeah, I think your point is very well made about sort of the artificiality of these communities and how, you know, I often lament the death of neighborhoods. And how, you know, in my parents' day, you know, if somebody lost their job, the neighbors showed up and said, oh, I'm so sorry. We're going to insist on doing your laundry. Here's this food. We're going to, you know, we're going to help you out. We're going to give you money, you know. And now that is unthinkable. Nobody would ever do that. I mean, even bringing food would be like, no, you're putting a spotlight on how that person lost their job. Leave it alone. We wouldn't dare do any of that. And yet we have these associations that decide on like how tall a fence can be, you know, what that can be made of. That basketball hoop is, you know, 1 foot too close to the road. And so you're going to have to tear it down. And everybody resents it. And everybody has complaints about their neighbors. And so it is this, as you say, it is this kind of like artificial community, but it's a community that's already rife with, you know, tension.
And that, yeah, there's a tension, and that's a good point, because there's tension clearly in this group from the very get-go. And you get the loudmouth again in his football jacket and all this other stuff. Like, you know, in the characters again are very clearly set out. I'd forgotten about some of the sort of early 2000s fashions, and that was quite interesting to go back and see. Lots of sort of like, you know, high calf boots on women. That was bizarre. But yeah, it was cool. I was watching it because again, it has a different. It's not just a remake. They've revamped it and they've set it up in a different way. And one of the things I really liked about this is they gave you another, you know. And this is obviously, we say about terror, because this is obviously post 9/11. And obviously, you know, the big thing post 9/11 was terrorist cells. Like, you don't know where they are, but there's these cells, and they could be anywhere.
Sleeper cells.
Sleeper cells. And they talk about, well, why would they come to Maple Street? Why would they be here? There's a reservoir. And so they identify that they've got a utility, you know, reservoir. It sort of feeds most of the town's business, isn't it? All these sort of domestic properties.
I just have to interject that after 9/11, we gave all of this money, not just to New York, but to all of these little towns across America that was to stop terrorism. And every little town people think is like, oh yeah, this is a legitimate target here, right?
Yeah. Well, but that was the point I like about that, when they say, well, there's the reservoir, and everyone goes, yeah, that would be a threat. And then, like you say, you go, but why here? What difference does this town make? Why would they not be targeting like New York or Washington or, you know, a large city, so they can, you know, like say, you know, there's a reason, not some small suburban town. It makes no sense. That's not what they see. They see that they are being attacked by terrorists, and that's, you know, then obviously this house is identified as being the other, and you constantly get like justifiable reasons, like eventually sort of, you know, as to what's gone on in this house. And so they've got this fence, and when they go knock on, no one answers, and then when they finally do get in, there is an explanation. The guy works nights, And when he's not there, especially if it's a new place, they're not supposed to answer the door to people. So they don't. And you go, all right, fine, that sort of makes sense if you're moving into a new neighborhood for a bit. Like, but they're not. It's all, as we said before, it's a narrative, and it becomes another nugget in an already established narrative to feed this conclusion. And so yeah, it's interesting how this one sort of plays out, because this one as well, the end, this sort of, it introduces the end of the first one, and then sort of like plays that out again, because the loudmouth pulls a gun on the pragmatist kind of lead character, and you know, he says that the guy says to him, he says, well, if you shoot me, fine, but when this is over, like, you're still accountable for shooting someone in the face. And it is a bit like, right, yeah, all right, you're fine, all right. Fair point at this point.
Yeah, and you feel in that moment, like, how much does he believe that this really is happening, right? Because if you really believe it, and you think this guy, you know, I mean, I'm not saying you should shoot, but I mean, if on the other hand there's some doubt, right, like this may resolve itself, and this isn't a sleeper cell, and I'm going to be held accountable for shooting this guy, right? Yeah. There's got to be some doubt. I think it's worth reviewing like what evidence they have in these two versions. So in the first one, you have the car, none of the cars start, and then, you know, the power just goes out, and then there's a car that starts by itself and then stops by itself, and then lights start going on, you know, and
in different houses light up at different, yeah,
right, especially at the end, it's just, you know, a cavalcade of, and so with the end, with the aliens being responsible, the idea is that they have just done this to increase the paranoia and finger pointing. So in the second one, I think it's remarkably careful. None of the cars start. No car starts on its own. The first thing that happens that, you know, isn't in sync with all the power and portable video game being turned off and everything is this family. The father comes home to his house with the, you know, with the fence around it, and they're shocked to see a moving car. Now, of course, that car's been outside of Maple Street, right? Yeah. So it hasn't been hit by the EMP or whatever it is, and then their house lights up. So those are the only things that, you know, obviously both point to that family, but those are the only points of evidence and the only departure from the sort of EMP effect.
Yeah, the only other suggestion of anything that comes from anybody is from, I forget her name, is the lady whose husband's a captain in the army. And she's the one that keeps like dropping information. She's like, I've heard about EMPs and what they can do. She's the one that identifies that they live next to a reservoir, and that's the kind of tactical target they want. And so it becomes this idea for me of just enough information to be dangerous. And that's what keeps fueling this, where she either confirms or instigates an idea that everyone goes, oh, yeah. Well, yeah. She's almost like, you know, if you were to take today's parlance, she'd be like social media. She just keeps injecting this idea that you can't really justify, but you know just enough to be stupid. Yeah. You know, like, I'm an anti-vaxxer because, well, nothing you said actually is true, but it sounds scientific. Or, you know, COVID is this, or whatever these things could be. It's that injection of, I've heard about EMPs, I've heard what they do to people, I've heard about what these sleeper cells, I've heard what they do. You know, it's constantly that, and it's just enough information. And it says this is what it means about information, but not being able to pass out fact from opinion, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I should say that there's another piece of evidence, which is just before the end, they start finding these surveillance devices.
Yeah,
and they point out that, you know, this father and this family works with an electronics store. So that's the third piece of evidence, and then that is just enough to just burn down the house, you know, kill them all. But yeah, I mean, this thing that, you know, you're talking about like a little knowledge and a little piece of evidence. it's worth pointing out how high the stakes are. And this is that maybe this is related to that, supposed Hitler quote about the big lie, right? But, if you convince people that there are sleeper cells and your neighbors could be part of a sleeper cell waiting to do another 9/11, right? We could have one here. It could be, especially after 9/11, it seems dumb, but on 9/11, 9/12, we thought this was going to happen repeatedly. We thought, this was the beginning of a new order, and, it didn't work out that way. But people really believe that. And if you think that communists have infiltrated the government and there's going to be a revolution in America, but by the same token, if you believe that there is a democratic conspiracy to kidnap children, now I should point out kidnappings are at phenomenally low rates. I mean, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than have a child kidnapped anymore. Not that it's not a big deal when it happens, but this is not an epidemic. But if you really believe that children are being kidnapped and having their body fluids, taken, and they're being eaten, let's investigate this. Let's go into that pizza place, and find out what's in that basement. So the stakes are big, but of course, it's all bullshit.
Yeah. And the thing is, it ends up in the sort of the tragedy. I mean, again, they make the point in this episode of when he's about to pull the trigger, and he says that when this is over, you're accountable. You've got to face up to what you've done. And as you say, at the end of it, it ends with them attacking the house of the guy who works for the whatever, the electronics store, and burning it down. And who knows how many, you don't see, that's where it ends. To be fair, it pans out and you find out that actually this was the American military running a test. And that opens up another bunch of questions for me. But like you say, when this is all simmers down, the next day, they killed a family. And it comes down. This thing comes down to, you could see a follow up to this. There'd be a series of what's the court case, where they all start blaming each other. So well, so and so did this, and then we called this. Well, no, the fact of the matter is, you were a mob, and that's the problem. And so, but yeah,
then you go to the judge and say, I was just following Donald Trump's orders. Right. No, everybody turns on everybody. This community's never going to be the same again. Right. I mean, what's going to happen to these kids? They've witnessed a family being murdered.
Well, the first one to attack the house is the kid. Yeah. He takes his hockey stick and he's the one that breaks the window to let his dad throw the gasoline tank in. Then somebody throws a Molotov cocktail in. So
I quite like that it was the kid who sort of
instigates it. But I love that this is where there's a future of this where a news reporter finds out this truth and leaks this, or prints this whole thing, that this was actually a military exercise and it's destroyed this family and this whole community. I mean, the fact was, who's culpable? But to be fair, the military didn't do anything other than turn the power off, and so the events played out. But yeah, it's a fascinating pair of episodes. It really is, and. Really does sort of get into a whole bunch of stuff. And it felt, like, as I say, really prescient for what we're going through at the moment. This idea of misinformation and, just enough information. It always makes me think of the quote from Men in Black, where Tommy Lee Jones' character says, a person is sensible. A person can be reasoned with. People are stupid. People are panicky. And that's sort of the idea. So, yeah, no, these are a cracking pair of episodes. Any final thoughts before we move on?
Well, I mean, I keep thinking about how both episodes have one person who's a stand-in for, sense, common sense. And, the real test, especially, I mean, I think in some ways the remake is better structurally. And I think the military thing works really well. Although, yeah, I mean, you're running psyops, on your own people. But,
MK Ultra, it happened,
No, sure. Right. But I mean, we need these people to stand up and say, this is not okay. And even in this episode, this remake, even his wife turns against him. And again, it's the, turn goes with the mob. And again says, I mean, she keeps repeating, like, it's them or us, like, better them than us. We've got to deflect this suspicion. But, the only thing that stops this is people standing up and saying, this is not the way we do things.
Yeah.
And that is obviously something we're struggling to do today. But I mean, we need that. And I'm reminded of how we think that we're able to do that, but take away people's power for a few hours. I mean, if you've ever been in like a blackout that lasts longer than 24 hours, there is like a sense of anything could happen now. Like, civilization is coming unglued, and I'm going to the grocery store. The chance of a fight or somebody getting killed here is 30%.
Just think of the panic buying when everyone was buying the bottled water or the toilet paper and all this other stuff. Fights did break out. People fighting car parks and shopping aisles. Fights did break out. So, we're not that far away from this. We have this sort of like, fallacy of civilization where we're like, no, we're above this. You take away or you add an element of tension or paranoia or panic, and it fades pretty quick. So, yeah. But this has been a doozy. Like, we've gone long on this one, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think these are just a double header, and it was a great episode to talk about. So we shall leave it there, though, and we shall continue our track. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening, and we shall talk to you on the next episode.